Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. This is the fantasy special. We covered quite a bit in this episode, but I think we're going to do this again because we could cover a lot more, and we just had a lot of fun. So next week, we have the legendary Phil Tippett on the show. If you've seen Star Wars, RoboCop, Starship Troopers, you know his work. What an interesting person. We hope you can join us for that. All right, let's make our way over to the bridge.
Welcome to the Tales from the Bridge fantasy special. So we're going to step out of our normal world this week, and talk about fantasy novels and that whole genre. I mean, some people would say all fantasy is sci-fi, and maybe that's an argument we can get into later. But sci-fi, my gateway into sci-fi was through fantasy novels. I grew up on Lord of the Rings and Wheel of Time and all of those classics, and getting into a more creative world for me, and escapism, that for me was a big special part of fantasy and led to my love of sci-fi. And so I'm kind of pumped about this show tonight. I've got a little bit of material here. I can talk about some of my favorite books. I think everyone here is kind of pumped about this as well. And so we're going to get down with some swords and dragons tonight. How you guys feeling about this?
Amazing.
Oh, yeah, I'm all about swords and dragons and fantasy. Can't go wrong.
Yeah. No, this is going to be fun.
Like I mentioned Lord of the Rings, but I think within fantasy, just to dive right in here, I think my favorite subgenre came to be sort of, I call it dark fantasy. Other people may have other names for it, but it's sort of grittier when compared to things like Wheel of Time, as I just mentioned. You know, it's not always questy. Right. So my big example for this one, the two that I'm going to bring to the table, first would be Glenn Cook, who wrote, who first kind of created a fantasy world with a grittier angle. And this is back in 1984. So this was The Black Company, was his series. And it's combines elements of epic fantasy and dark fantasy, and it follows an elite mercenary unit. And so the story isn't told on behalf of royalty or that of a chosen one, but rather the grunts who have to risk their lives on behalf of their more privileged masters. And what you get is essentially a war novel with the sort of visceral quality that fighting with swords brings into the equation. And the other book I'll mention in this genre, sort of subgenre within fantasy, who I think is kind of the current master, but I'm a little dated because I've just been doing sci-fi lately, would be Steven Erikson and his series, The Milesian Book of the Fallen. It's complex. It's pretty dark. It's really dark. And I mean, to the point that like Game of Thrones looks like an Arthurian tale compared to The Milesian Book of the Fallen. These series are deadly. But yeah, so those are books that I can easily sort of talk about, but I feel a little bit out of date. I know that I feel like just like sci-fi fantasy, much has probably happened in fantasy in the last 10 years or 5 years. I'm maybe some of you kind of know what that is and will have suggestions. And if our listeners have, I think, recommendations for us, be kind of pumped if you want to share them to our Facebook or social media somewhere. Give us some reading ideas, because we'll probably do this again. Anyways, but that's where, for me, fantasy went from like, you know, Lord of the Rings, which is kind of fun and escapist, and I quickly looked for the dark side. So,
yeah,
when you say dark, do you mean like dark magic or and like that being like the mood, or there being like heavy violence and murder and torture, that kind of thing?
It's heavy violence, right?
Like it's the crossover to horror, right? Is it fantasy crossover to horror? Kind of like, you know, they're like three subgenres of speculative fiction. Then you get the parts in the middle.
Yeah, it's
Clive Barker, I think, right? Did you read Clive Barker?
Almost. Yeah, I never read
like
his
horror fantasy. Yeah,
horror fantasy.
Yeah, but it's like pretty. You know, the Milesian Book of the Fallen, especially like that whole series, is just gritty. The world is gritty. There's, you know, it's and they take a different path in terms of working with magic and gods, and so they crossed a lot of different into a lot of different sort of areas there. But I think the through line is that you will get every detail of someone's death, laid out for you. It's almost too much. In fact, I had to leave the series, I think, a few books in. There was just one point where it was, I don't know, I think the book was called Trail of Tears or something. It just makes the road look like something fun. Like, it's pretty dark. Yeah. So, but there was the first, I think, 4 books in particular were really strong. And lots of storylines to try and keep up with and navigate. I believe the author actually has a background in anthropology, and it really does come through in the writing. There were tribes, and you get an evolutionary sort of sense of where they came from and their motivations through that. And it's wild. It's a great, at least the first 4 or 5 books are just a treat. But yeah, it's pretty dark stuff. You kind of got to be in that right headspace.
Right.
And that was Erickson?
Yeah. So this is Steven Erickson.
Okay.
And he's written, and this is, I'm just looking at his thing here. So this is the pseudonym of Steve Roon London, a Canadian novelist who was educated and trained as an archaeologist and anthropologist. So, and his first book is the weakest one in the whole series, Gardens of the Moon, came out in 1999. And in this series concluded with The Crippled God in 2011. But yeah, it's quite a ride. It's quite good. I would, to start into this sort of subgenre, I would start with The Black Company. It's classic. They're really kind of fun. They're sort of, small unit of lovable mercenaries hacking their way through, lots of trials and tribulations, kind of fun characters and snarky. They kind of capture what a small military unit goes through, right? Oh, someone's always screwing them over, right? And that's the other side of this that I always kind of liked. That there's a sort of proletariat view of fantasy. It's like, you always get the king's view, right? There's the royalty view and the sort of top 2% is, tend to be the headliners for a lot of sci-fi. And what I like about this genre is that you get to see it from the ground up, right? So you're at the widest part of the pyramid. looking up and getting their experience, and if Lord of the Rings was told in this sort of vein, you would hear an orc's point of view. You would hear, some grunt in from the Gondorian army or Gondor, like had to chuck a spear and try to avoid, whatever, fire from the dragon type stuff. So I kind of like that side of it. And anyways, not to dominate the fantasy conversation. I know we all have our own fantasy sort of favorites here, but it's not hard for me to go off on this topic.
Sounds cool.
Yeah. I imagine, Kevin, jump in whenever I talk about books that you've read too, because I think we've read a lot of the same books maybe in fantasy. So I too started life as a fantasy lover. I read Lord of the Rings far too early. I don't know, grade 6? Maybe, I don't know, 7, it was one of the first things I read. I read some Piers Anthony around that time and classic 80s stuff. David Eddings, right? So I grew up on a lot of the David Eddings was all the extra hardcovers that you've seen in used bookstores for the last 40 years. Half of those are David Eddings books because they produce so many of them. And there was the Belgariad and then the Malorian. These are series of 5, and then the Iliad, and then the blah blah blah. But I wanted to tell you about one thing from my childhood that I loved and I think is the best thing ever. My favorite subgenre of fantasy from my childhood anyway. It was definitely not dark. It was very different. It was Arthurian. Okay, so this is Taliesin by Stephen R. Lawhead, part of the trilogy that he wrote. First one is Taliesin, the second one is Merlin, and the third one is Arthur. And it's just a retelling, one of the many thousands of retellings of Arthur that have been made. And I love that series. I was very formative. The Dragon King trilogy. No, that's a different one. Anyway, so and then probably the last fantasy I managed to keep reading when I was still youngish was Guy Gavriel Kay. So he's a Canadian author. He lives in Toronto. He's written a lot of amazing books, and he is just out of this world. I mean, I don't know the awards and popularity contests in the fantasy world, but to me, he's been knocking them out for a long time. He's had some lows. actual books that I've hated and been really disappointed in. I won't mention any names, but way more than that. He's had like everything he writes is just amazing. He wrote the Fionavar Tapestry. I think that was early 90s, maybe even 80s. Very mature fantasy trilogy, like past teenager kind of thing, like about university kids. Great trilogy to read, in your late teens, early 20s. And then he did a bunch of historical fantasy novels. Tigana, A Song for Arbonne, Sailing to Sarantium. He did, and it's really nice to just have a brilliant author write like single books. And it's like, here's one book set in troubadour France of like the Middle Ages. And it's a historical fantasy, and it's great. He does political intrigue so well. He does characters and all that so well. Anyway, so I'm a big fan. Guy Gavriel Kay is probably my favorite fantasy author, certainly favorite Canadian. Now then, I stopped reading fantasy. I just couldn't do it. I got into sci-fi and all that. And then late in life, in my 30s, I discovered Patrick Rothfuss, The Name of the Wind, hailed as the next thing in fantasy, adult fantasy, the next George R.R. Martin. And it's fucking great. It's better than George R.R. Martin by a long shot. I only read his first book. But this is fantasy for like adult people. It's great. You've read this, right, Tristan? You can jump in here, man.
Yeah.
You like it, right? And this is a subgenre that is about magic. Like, how do you do magic? Every fantasy has to invent its own form of magic, right? And I think that's what it's all about. Like, he does such a good job of that. What do you think of that book?
Well, Kevin, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that's kind of the delineator, isn't it, between fantasy and other genres, if there exists some form of magic or something that's otherworldly, that's not scientific. Everybody brands it as fantasy. And yeah, I mean, you know what I like about Patrick Rothfuss and The Name of the Wind and that series, and I've read all of them, is there's a logic to the magic. It's obviously there's leaps of kind of leaps of logic, but it makes some internal sense. There exists energy that you transform in some way, and it's funny because there's the Aragon series by Christopher Paolini uses this same idea around how magic can occur. You can change things and you can lift heavy objects, but it still takes the same amount of energy. So it'll wipe your body energy unless you can find it from somewhere else. And those are cool because then you can start to, as a reader, strategize and think about how can the protagonist go about doing things in this world and do it in a way that kind of makes sense. You might say to yourself, oh, that's internally consistent, or what a brilliant idea. And yeah, Patrick Rothfuss, I loved all those. It seems like the last one in this series that's supposed to be coming out has been supposed to be coming out for like a decade now.
Oh yeah, I think it's the most anticipated book in the world by now, other than George R.R. Martin's finale to Game.
I don't think anything's coming from George R.R. Martin. I think he's
going to do it eventually. It's just gaining value every year. Like, it'll just be worth 200 times what it will be worth now if he puts it out, if he lives long enough to finish writing it 10 years from now. Who knows? Somebody will do it.
That would be the last Guns N' Roses album,
But yeah, Patrick Rothfuss, everybody's been waiting for that for a long time. Apparently a manuscript exists, and there's some rumors on the internet, and his fans are huge, right? And I don't know. Anyway, Patrick Rothfuss.
I could talk Lord of the Rings all day long because I did read those as a teenager, and I probably liked them too much, and it just stopped me from wanting to do too much else. But Patrick Rothfuss was it changed the way I look at science or fantasy in a way, because there wasn't a whole lot of action. I mean, it's an 800 to 1,000 page book, I think, right? Mm-hmm. And if you really were to break down the story, it's not that huge.
Well, each book is 24 hours. I mean, nominally, right? A man telling a story for
but he's telling a story within those 24 hours.
Of course, yes.
But the story he tells spans over, I think we get at least the first 20 years, right? Or maybe 18 years in the first book.
Maybe.
But I was caught. It grabbed me right away. I mean, when you hear about losing his parents who were performers, and that shaping him and him living in the forest and playing not the guitar, not the lute. I can't think of what the instrument is, but might have been a lute.
I think it was a lute, wasn't it?
Yeah. But he learns how to play that while being in the woods. It was just like, oh my God, this is so beautiful. And the way he wrote that book, you don't need a lot of action because his sentences are beautiful. And I love that book, The Name of the Wind, and I look forward to Wise Man's Fear, which is that's what it is, right? Wise Man's Fear.
Yeah, that's the second one. Yeah, you
So
got
I
to
look
read
forward
that.
to
And
that.
everybody's been waiting for the third one for
And then everyone's waiting for the third. So I feel like I can't be one of those people that are waiting for the third yet, simply because I have to finish the second. And I'm sure a lot of people who are hardcore fans are like, you're not a fan until you've read that other novella that he wrote too.
But, so where does like Name of the Wind fall in? Like it's sort of grown up, but what is it like? We got, so we have wizards, or like what's the setting?
It is exactly and almost humorously a Harry Potter story for adults. Like it is literally a guy telling his story about how he went to wizard school and what they taught him there and what went wrong and what went right. But it's just so he's in a pub in the future after being I don't know, wizard, hired assassin. I barely remember anything from this book except that I loved it. So he's telling the story of his life, like in a pub in the future, and you're getting the first 18 years of his life. And it's just so well written, but it is literally like a reflection up into adult world of the Harry Potter-ish story. Not that she invented that. It's just she's dominated the genre. Just like, this brings me to one of my books. I'll just jump into it. The Magicians, Lev Grossman. He also, right? He used to be editor of New York Times book something. This is a major guy. They made a television series out of this. It's amazing.
It's a great book. Yeah.
Oh, you've read this? Have you read the second one too? There's a series.
Not
it's a trilogy. And they made a TV show out of it. So Lev Grossman also, right? Totally his consciously, I think, adult reflection of the Harry Potter story. It's people going to wizard school. So I think that's its own subgenre, probably.
Yeah,
kind of a Neil Gaiman influence, I think there.
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. But okay, so I also wanted to then this brings us also speaking of subgenres that talk about magic, right? How the magic works. I think most of the that's always an element. You have to invent your own form of magic. In the ones that Patrick Rothfuss is very thermodynamic, I would say. So it's the physics is clear, right? To me, right? Everything he's talking about is basic thermodynamics. It's just that the human will can exert shaping directions on things, I guess, right? But you're ultimately taking heat and using it in interesting ways, or kinetic energy, right, and transforming it. So I think a lot of authors do that, but very significantly, N.K. Jemisin, right? Nora Jemisin, who we've been talking about. Her book, you guys, it's actually labeled sci-fi, the Broken Earth trilogy. Sorry, it's actually, geez, man, we can't get our fantasy and sci-fi straight tonight at all. We're all flipping it. Anyway, it's labeled fantasy on the spine. And like you said, Sam, right, it's got a map in the front. That means that's fantasy.
100%.
Not
yeah.
fantasy. But it won the Hugo 3 years in a row, and it won a Nebula at the end. And now it definitely qualifies as science fiction. And it's a beautiful cross between them because she does even more, I think, exactly what I love about Rothfuss. The explanation of magic through some sort of future scientific basis, right? Like she's taking geological and earth energy, the motion and pressures in the earth, and funneling them and being able to shape them. And so that whole series is probably my favorite fantasy series, I think I would have to say, along with Patrick Rothfuss. But I should also mention, I would be remiss not to say, N.K. Jemisin actually came from writing a lot more fantasy than science fiction before she started writing or being acclaimed as a science fiction author. So the Inheritance trilogy she wrote before that, and it's straight fantasy. Gods and goddesses and sort of divinity kind of stuff, and it's basically like the story of like the good and bad form of God being incarnated as like a dysfunctional family by means of which one of them killed and murdered their sister, and they were both in love with her, and it's like pretty freaking crazy shit psychologically, right? But she's writing out mythology of gods living incarnated, among humans, and it's great. I've read the first two. It is like book number 3 of trilogy number 8 that I'm getting around to right now. And so N.K. Jemisin.
Well, I agree. It is classic, right? Like it's got the road trip. She's on like you say, there's a map at the front, and they go on a quest. Essentially, it's taken a little bit differently, and say someone comes into their power along the way, it's right. It's absolutely classic fantasy with a really interesting twist, because like you said, magic comes from a sort of naturalist sort of there's an explanation behind, like what Kevin you were talking about there, where we can have some sort of scientific-ish sciencey sort of approach
an
to
explanation, right? There's some type of an explanation for it, and then you can kind of jump on it. And that's the N.K. Jemisin. It's interesting that she comes from fantasy as well. Adrian Tchaikovsky as well, right? Also, he came from fantasy. It seems like there's a fairly large overlap between those authors.
And Elizabeth Bear, she writes both, concurrently, basically.
Yeah, that's right. And obviously, a lot of people categorize the two things together, and then I think that there's some basis for justification for doing that. It's just that we're kind of dispensing with that scientific component. But fantasy, we have to suspend our disbelief for a lot of good science fiction. So it makes sense that we kind of think about the two in the same realm. I would like to point out some of my very favorite fantasy authors. Recently, contemporary fantasy authors are all women. So Marty, you've already mentioned N.K. Jemisin, who's outstanding. But Susanna Clarke, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, we've talked about that one before. That's a great one on plausible magic, a kind of an alternate history where magic still exists a little bit in our world, and there can be a resurgence of it. That was a long book, but I really, really enjoyed that one. Another one of the same vein is The Last Magician, which is almost an alternative history, but it's funny because it involves time travel, and it involves The Last Magician is by Lisa Maxwell, if I didn't say that. And it involves time travel, but the time travels through magic. And so there's no scientific basis for it whatsoever. And it comes from the same idea of Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, if anybody's read that one, where magic used to exist, but then it's sort of petered away. But there's the opportunity to create a resurgence of magic. So it's really good. We just recently read the first in that series as a book to read kind of with my kids. And I don't know that it is young adult. Maybe it is young adult. I have a difficult time telling what's young adult and what isn't. But I love that.
What's the first one called?
The Last Magician by Lisa Maxwell. That one is the time travel plus magic book. Highly recommend. Contemporary, I think that one was published fairly recently. But I have to also
reading Novak, right? With by yourself and with your kids.
Naomi Novik, Novik books are awesome. She has one young adult book that I know of called A Deadly Education, which is perfectly down this realm of Harry Potter, wizarding school, like we were talking about with In the Name of the Wind, right? That one is fully in that camp. But Naomi Novik is a phenomenal fantasy author. Some of her other books, in particular, Uprooted and Spinning Silver, those ones are outstanding. I believe one of those either was nominated for or won a Nebula, maybe nominated. I think it might have been Spinning Silver.
Yeah, I heard somebody I respect. I won't say who, but because I don't remember. But it was somebody like Neil Gaiman or I don't know, Neil Tchaikovsky saying like, Spinning Silver is the most amazing book I've ever read. Like he was just a gog, right? If I could ever write a book that good, I'd be really happy with myself. Anyway, somebody said that. I think it was along those lines. I've been looking for that.
Mm-hmm. I recommend that one. Like if we weren't a science fiction book club, I would say Spinning Silver would be a book that I would recommend. Certainly, it is an outstanding one. But yeah, so those are all some great female fantasy authors that are contemporary and highly recommend.
Ever wondered what it takes to make it in the movie business? Peel back the curtain with 4-6 Success Filmmaking. 4-6 Success Filmmaking is where filmmakers share their stories and the secrets.
It's beyond competitive out there.
There have been movies that it's taken me 10 years to get made.
Don't wait to create. Like, you've got to just keep making stuff.
Tune in to 4-6 Success Filmmaking for your dose of cinematic realness, direct from the voices that have lived it.
Nice. Well, I just have one more I want to cap off with. Then, if we're just going to go through the list of the books, so one other on Damien Walter, his top 21 of the 21st century. He had very few, like 6 or 7 authors. The rest of them were of science fiction storytellers. But one had like a pre thing that he judged to be worthy of his valuable acclaim, and that was China Mieville. And China Mieville, along with Mitchell, right, got the extra +2 tag on. And China Mieville, I've finally done it. Almost, I'm literally on the last 15 pages. These are the last pages I have on Perdido Street Station, which is a monster tome of a 700+ page book, and it is emblematic of the new weird. Okay, and so a lot of people classify this China Mieville, especially his first book, Perdido Street Station, as fantasy, as sci-fi, but it's clearly fantasy and it's clearly horror. It's a really like right in the middle of that triangle, and what he qualifies it as, along with a few other authors that I think have a similar genre. It's kind of new. He calls it the new weird, and it's definitely that. It's just freaking weird. It's a sort of a fantasy world in that like there's kind of thaumaturgical currents and magic that works alongside sort of a steampunk version of science, but in this wacky city that has like cactus people and eagle people and insect people and humans, and it's really like down and dirty and like insect human and main character science fiction guy, or it opens with a sex scene with an insect human, and it just gets you right in there. You're like, oh, this is weird and creepy, but all these people live and fall in love with each other and live together and have sex, and it's weird, man. There's like science and steampunk and I don't know, moths that suck people's souls and minds out of them, which are the main enemy. And it's the weirdest thing I've ever read. It's beautifully written. Like his language is awesome, like a fine wine. I post to Facebook like quotes from this book, just when they're really good. You're like, mwah, thank you, maestro. But it's also a little Ian M. Banks for fantasy meets horror.
And what is it again? Can you say the author and title again?
China Mieville is the author's name. China Mieville. He's written lots of books now, like I don't know, 20. He's won the Hugo and Nebula, I think, and Locus all the time. He's every book he's written, I think, has won the Locus. His other most famous one is The City and the City. Those are the two that show up on the Hugo and Nebula list. But then he was written Kraken, which is like, it sounds like an octopus. Is written Rail Sea, which is basically the Moby Dick story placed on rail instead of boats, fighting giant badgers instead of whales. Yeah. Oh, it's on my shelf. I can't wait to read that.
This is weird. The new weird. I tell you, I'm into that. I like the new weird. If we're talking about the new weird, we got to talk about Haruki Murakami. If anybody read IQ 84, that was a weird book. I did anybody read that one? IQ 84?
Not that one.
No. He's have you read others of his stuff? Haruki Murakami. He's a Japanese writer, and his stuff has been translated to English. But I can speak to IQ 84 because I've read that one. That was just weird. And if this is a genre, the new weird, I love it because it's outlandishly strange, and it's like this one in particular. The world seems like everything is the same except for a few very small things, like a second moon in one world but not in another, or strange vessels for collecting semen from a man and giving it to another person in another world. Like just outlandish things that would make me not want to recommend this book to many people because it would like label me as just a strange guy. But I really enjoyed the book. I just don't know that I would recommend it to too many people because it's pretty outlandish. Amazing.
I actually feel the same about Mieville.
Yeah.
I think if you're the kind of person that just savors every page, likes a slightly rambling story, that just sort of, it's like storytelling, right? He's just like painting you into this world for a long time. Then Miyaville's good for you. For me, I was like halfway there for that. I don't know about Murakami. I wouldn't mind a shorter version of Miyaville.
I've read 1.5 of his books, I think, and because it is this sort of new. Weird is a great way to put it. I had my friend who recommended it to me. Kat had called it a sort of like reality with a twist or something like that, and or magic infused reality. And I thought that was a good way to put it. And really quiet stories in a way, like they're, you kind of, they're almost like, I read the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, and I tried to get through Norwegian Wood, and that was the one that kind of beat me down a little bit. But even the Wind Up Bird Chronicle was something I think experienced rather than enjoyed or disliked. There's some middle ground that I occupied, and it felt like I kind of dreamt my way through it. And I'm glad I read it, but I don't know that I would go back to it. I wouldn't read it again in a weird way. Like it was fully interesting, and definitely the writing's spectacular. But now, who was the author for? We talked about. She wrote, I think, Piranesi, and the
Suzanne.
She wrote Norrell, and then she followed it up with Piranesi.
Susanna Clark.
Susanna Clark. So, and again, that was like, I loved the Magician novel, but her follow up, I think it's Piranesi. I couldn't do it, and it's the same thing where it was just a little. Someone, I was reading, going, someone's going to love this, but that's just.
But it's not me.
Yeah,
but it wasn't. Would you say that was new weird, or was that just new literary? Literary too far.
That was new weird in a way. Well, that actually read to me like a Twilight Zone episode, but certainly not near where you are with China, and somewhere in between,
Yeah.
But like Haruki, I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly. Haruki Murakami. I do feel like I'm reading something there that I'm going to find a review in the New Yorker for, and same with like Piranesi or something like, but I have to be really in the right headspace to read those books personally.
I think there are certain Marvel movies that I enjoy far more and do far more for me as a human being than any single one of the Lord of the Rings movies, despite the fact that I love it as a tribute to blah, blah, blah. But they're not that interesting. They're not that innovative in terms of the actual story. The story is very old plaid.
Well, are they science fiction or fantasy? Are the Marvel movies science fiction or fantasy? If they were to lean,
it doesn't matter. They're certainly. But more
if we,
than fantasy.
Well, saying we're talking about fantasy on this episode, would the Marvel movies? Would you be able to shove them over into this fantasy box?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, well, Doctor Strange, 100%, right? So they do that bridge. They have magic, straight up, no sciencey stuff. It's not tech. There's magic in the Marvel universe, and it works, and it's powerful, and it runs the universe. So yeah, you can drag all the section of the Doctor Strange overlap into the fantasy realm without question. And yet, the rest of them are all much more sci-fi, with Iron Man, obviously, Batman, whatever, like the tech sci thing. Human mutants, the whole X-Men frame is much more sci-fi, I guess, but not the Red Witch is like clearly.
So it's blurry. You're saying overall, it's a blurry.
They just claim as much space, and they do mythology as well, the gods and their magic, right? Like they claim as much of the speculative fiction realm, I think, as they can, with some horror on occasion, right? Later in years, so that's fine. But what does that mean? What is that? What's the? Who cares?
Yeah, it doesn't really matter if they fit in there, I guess. Yeah, because I mean, there's also
the movies are better.
Yeah, maybe are they their own genre? Maybe this is a good debate for. This is a good segment. Is where do superheroes fit in? Are they sci-fi, fantasy, both? Because they
fit in both. I think Marty sums it up pretty well there. With Doctor Strange being like, yeah, I see that as fantasy, but then mutants, yeah, that's kind of sci-fi, and Batman, it's kind of sci-fi also because you got sci tech and yeah. So I see that in Swamp Thing fantasy. Like you could just keep going back and forth. So it is a good one. I do find it odd though that in the Marvel movies these people have so many powers, but most of the time they're just punching and kicking each other.
That's a good point.
It seems kind of silly to me. It's like, oh, we have so many powers. Just punch, kick.
Yeah,
punch,
if I had laser eyes, I would only use laser eyes. It's like threat.
Yeah. There's a couple of characters that actually do that, but even those characters, they're still punching and kicking a lot.
Is that not also true of, the Lord of the Rings? Gandalf is so powerful he could call down, but he doesn't. He's a weakling and runs.
Pulls out a sword.
Pulls out a sword.
No, he's not though. He's got a couple tricks up his sleeve, but not really.
You could make that argument about all the powerful people in Lord of the Rings that they don't actually use their powers much.
Wait a minute. So are you saying that we should have a Lord of the Rings versus Marvel episode sometime?
Hey, sure. Yeah. That's a weird one.
That would get so much hate.
Way,
let's get weird. Why not? Let's do it. We'll do a segment. We'll make it a segment. Instead of a special, we'll just do like weird places our conversations have gone.
Have you guys been watching Raised by Wolves at all?
No.
This is a really shockingly unique and symbolic, sci-fi work. Like, it's great. You should check it out. It's way better than anything else I've seen.
Oh, totally. We just finished Hawkeye. So in the Marvel. That was fun.
That was fun. Yeah, we liked Hawkeye.
Yeah.
And what'd you think of Boba Fett?
Oh, it was good enough. It was
good enough. It was good enough for me. It was not good enough for my children. And again, this sort of spoiled child syndrome, for they're like, oh, it's not that great. I mean, he's not all that, and there wasn't and it's true. They were all like, yeah, that's fine, but fine is good for me. I'm okay with that. A lot of effort. They brought more of the world to life for me. Like, everything doesn't have to be the best thing ever made.
Yeah, exactly. I think maybe you said, I was like, I had to wait so long for a good Star Wars piece of media to watch after Return of the Jedi that I'll take what I can get, right? So I'm kind of okay with it. Like, I enjoyed it, and Mel and Evelyn kind of made fun of it a little bit, but we ended up watching them all, and they definitely like The Mandalorian. That's certainly better.
We did too. I mean, The Mandalorian was significantly better somehow. I don't know how to put my finger on it, but I think, Boba Fett, the main actor, he's just a little too staid, old, grim, stiff. It's not who they've got for The Mandalorian, and the problem was she was too, right? I love her. I forget her name. The woman, right? That is his the number 2.
Yeah.
She was great in a lot of things. I think Star Trek Discovery, right? She's in that recently, and a whole bunch of stuff. She's in everything.
Yeah.
But she was also playing her stiff, staid, grumpy old self character. And 2 of those, that's a little too much. And that doesn't work for Star Wars. Like, what are you thinking? You got to have a funny guy and a straight guy, a woman, whatever it is, right? Like,
totally.
2 of those, come on. That's why it failed.
Yeah. And what is The Mandalorian? It's essentially the rifleman, right? Cowboy shows up in a dusty town, solves the town's problem, moves on to the next town, right? And it's a proven device, totally fun. Have a through line in there, and you got yourself a pretty solid series, right? And what is Tatooine but the perfect set for a space western? It's like,
and perfect. They tried to invert it, I guess, with Boba Fett, where it's not the cowboy that shows up in town; it's the good guy gang boss. Like, a little weird. Like, he's not a heroic character except in his memories, I guess. It's like, okay, so you're the new Jabba the Hutt, and that's not working for me in terms of hero arc or something. I don't know.
And those mods were kind of like the on the floating scooters, and I was just like, and it's like, I was like, you guys don't really the idea is kind of fun, but not they just felt like out of place, it's like, I'm sorry, this is dirty, gritty Tatooine, and you guys are going around on floating mopeds. It doesn't work. I hate to break it to you, it's not that.
And also, like, the whole thing, I was willing to suspend disbelief, all that stuff. Yay, you're creating a world for me. I'm enjoying the visuals, but fundamentally, the plot is he's taken in by, the desert peoples. He's raised as one of them. It's great. I'm into that classic story. Da, da, da. He decides that he's going to extort all the other criminals in the world of his world single-handedly who have been killing all these people. He goes and kills them all, and guess what? He gets everybody killed. Like, okay, classic story, but it was just a little too lame. Really? What, are you surprised that you went down there and you got everybody that you love that just raised you killed by the gang you just pissed off and did nothing to protect against? Like, that was just like, okay, you're now relying on an old story device too formulaically for me to take you seriously. I think that's where they lost me.
I didn't get past episode 3. I haven't gone past that. I'll probably check out the Obi-Wan, because that's the thing is, it's almost they're revisiting the prequel stories, and I still like those, but I also recognize that they're silly. But seeing Ewan McGregor reprise that role, and apparently Hayden Christensen as Darth Vader is back, and probably other surprise characters too, right? Like, they're going for it.
I got all day for that.
That's the thing, though. Is are they really wringing this out? Are they really wringing out the towel? And I feel like there's. I don't want to be. I know when it comes to Star Wars, I always sound like the grumpy grouch here, but like I feel like since watching The Force Awakens in 2015, I liked it. But I saw, okay, so we can now reach this point of mediocrity and just kind of slowly come down. And that's what Star Wars has been doing for me since. Even The Mandalorian, I thought it was a good show. It did not up my Star Wars at all. It just kind of like, there was certain parts, the ending with Luke, but I don't know. I'm just feeling, that's the grumpy tea.
Grumpy tea.
Okay, so the awesome people at Tor.com have sent us a few fantasy novels, and one we've got here is by Kate Elliott. It's called Servant Mage, and it just came out in January.
Yeah. What else you got?
We've got a book by Andrea Hairston, who is a novelist, essayist, and playwright. And the book is called Redwood and Wildfire, and this just came out on the 1st of February, 2022.
Very cool.
So check that one out if you're interested in reading some newly released fantasy from Tor.com. And another one we've got here is I've heard a lot about Alex E. Harrow, and this is the second book in I'm not sure how many books there's going to be in this series, but this is the second book, and it's called A Mirror Mended. The first book was called A Spindle Splintered, and it's basically like a new take on old fairy tales.
A spindle splintered and a mirror mended. I think they're doing something very clever with their titles there. They're working on the alliteration. That's great. That's good.
I've heard good things about this, and the story seems very meta. It seems like a new fantasy, a new take on fantasy. So they seem pretty interesting. But thank you again, Tor.com, for sending us these books.
Well, we've had a lot of great experience reading and Tor books and interviewing their authors, primarily in the sci-fi genre. But I mean, as I think we've shown, like in this episode, is that we got some fantasy fans here, but we look forward to seeing some sci-fi stuff from them in the future.
Okay, thank you for joining us, everyone. We hope you enjoyed that one. Please leave us a review or rating. We just want to hear from you. Send us an email. Let us know what you think of the show. Ask us a question. Tell us about a book you're reading. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, next week, Phil Tippett. You're going to love this one. We go some pretty wild places. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Until next time.